This book was written by a friend of mine. We talked about it last week. Trust me, if you're going to order it, you should order it at the beginning of the episode. I understand it's already 3 weeks out of print, so it's going to be, they're printing them as fast as they can. Chris Stewart is a guy who I read one of his other books on my last vacation. I think it was in January, and I actually called him while I was on vacation. I got yelled at by my wife. "What are you doing? You're on vacation." I said, "I have to talk to this guy." This is the best written history book I have ever read because he's a fantastic storyteller. And the stories that he tells in Miracle of Freedom, 7 Tipping Points That Saved the World, are the stories of how we got here and how we came this close to not being here. He left out the American Revolution, which I might argue with, but he says at the end of the book, and I'm not going to spoil it for you, but he says at the end of the book, I know there are more than 7 tipping points, but these are remarkable. The defeat of the Assyrians, a story really I barely even knew. The end of this story is remarkable. The victory of the Greeks over the Persians, right? It was the Persians, yeah. Story of arrogance. Constantine coming to Rome and uniting the empire starts with a baby found in the trash. The defeat of Islam in France, where we had no reason to win. Christians had no reason to win against Islam in France, but they drew a line in the sand. The Mongols in Eastern Europe. When I heard John Kerry, do you remember when John Kerry testified and he said, "This is reminiscent of Genghis Khan"? And I thought, who says Genghis except for somebody who's married to Teresa? But I knew that Genghis Khan was a bad guy. And I knew that he was, you know, things that would later be quoted as reminiscent of would be very bad. But I had no idea. I think this guy made Adolf Hitler look like a rookie. Bad. We'll tell you this story a little bit tonight. 1492, an interesting story of absolutely no hope for the West, and suddenly new hope. 2 days before, was it 2 days before or 1 day before the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria went out? Does anybody know what happened in Spain? Just within 2 days before they set sail. Pretty significant. Pardon me? They were looking for a bailout. No, they weren't looking for a bailout. Yes? Rex? What?
Did they purge the Jews?
Yes, they purged the Jews. And I thought, my gosh, what a dark period. And then the next day, boats go out to start a new period of real enlightenment. It's amazing. And then 1940, a story of one man alone. Everyone called him crazy. And really, it was the turning point. And we saved the world because of one man in England. Let me introduce you to Chris Stewart. Chris, first of all, best written stories of history. You can't turn the pages fast enough. You bring it to life. Thank you for writing history this way.
You're overly kind, Glenn, but thank you.
Tell me about the defeat of the Assyrians. Who were the Assyrians and what happened?
You know, and that's one of my favorite stories in the book. Everyone always asks, what's your favorite story? And it's really impossible to choose just one of them. And think about this. In the entire history of the world, in the thousands of years that we are talking about, we've selected 7 stories. And each of them are so compelling and so interesting, and they literally are these tipping points. So when people ask, well, let's start with this, or why is this interesting to you, I always feel like, well, what's my favorite child? It's hard to choose. But before I answer your question, could I back up just a little bit?
Yeah.
And that is, this book is it's a story of freedom. It answers a question, as you were indicating, where does freedom come from? And it also makes a point that freedom is extraordinarily rare. In the whole history of the human race, scientists estimate that maybe 100 to 110 billion people have lived on this earth, maybe 125 billion, depending on who you talk to. And yet a tiny, tiny percentage of those people have experienced anything that we would consider free today.
Even China-style freedom looks good under what most people have experienced in the history of mankind.
And you know, you indicated that here with the story of the child that was, you know, they just didn't value human life. We're talking about abject slavery. We're talking about torture, this constant fear of who will be our next leader. You know, our idea of freedom is, well, do I have enough gas to go down to Walmart and buy another Xbox? These people were dealing with, how do I survive another day?
Okay, let's do this differently then. I'm not going to start at the beginning. Let's just jump around because we're here. Let's start with the baby in the trash. Tell me about the baby in the trash.
Well, you know, that was about the time of Christ, and the Roman Empire was very, very powerful and considered a fairly progressive and fairly mild empire in the sense of how they treated those people that fell under their rule. And yet, they just simply didn't value human life the way we do today. And that's what we were hoping to illustrate with that part of the story, is that even with these fairly progressive empires, that they just didn't understand what you and I take for granted, and that is a Roman soldier wrote to his wife in Alexandria, and he was saying she was about to give birth, and he said, if it's a son, keep him. But if it's a daughter, just throw him away. And, you know, it's impossible for you and I to imagine that, speaking of one of our children, a child that was going to be born. And yet it was fairly common at that time. They preferred the sons for very obvious reasons and didn't have much value in their daughters. And, you know, that's a great illustration about this was a very brutal time. And when I say this, I mean up until the modern day when we have this explosion of freedom, this golden age of freedom that we see around us now.
The story starts out, this chapter starts out with a little boy going to search for food in a trash heap on a barge or something, right?
Yeah.
On the river,
yeah.
Or just outside of Rome. And starts to go through the trash heap because he's a Christian, and Christians at this point in Rome, not popular. So
yeah.
What are you living like?
He was a Christian Jew. And as I don't think most people recognize, most of the early converts to Christianity were Jews. And they were not, of course we know, the Christians weren't treated very well in the Roman Empire.
And especially Christian Jews.
Yeah, that's
right.
Kind of a double
right.
whammy there. And so they were doing what a lot of people did, and Rome was a fairly wealthy city, and like unfortunately today, they threw out a lot of food that would sustain people around the world. And so it was common for people to go through the garbage heaps and to be looking for food or anything of any value, actually. And in doing so, he came across what was not that unusual, an infant who had been thrown away and had survived a night and decided to take her home.
So he hears the cries of this baby as he's going through the trash heap, and he's putting apple peels into his pocket, and he hears the cries of a baby and picks him up. And you suddenly realize that he is totally unique in the culture, that the culture is set up to a point to where anybody else, a Roman citizen, would have left the baby just in the trash heap. It's not like you go to the police and say, hey, he then takes the baby and goes to his uncle,
yeah.
who is Josephus.
Yeah.
Who is Josephus?
Well, and Josephus in this case isn't the Josephus that you
Oh, it's not. I thought it was.
In history. No, it's a character who would have lived sometime after that.
Okay.
But the whole point of this story is to illustrate, as you were saying, that this was a turning point in culture in the sense of for the first time, this Judeo-Christian idea that every person is of value, including slaves, including those who are not free, including those who are not citizens. Every person has a value.
So then Constantine comes, and because he sees a cross in the sky, and he says, with this symbol you will become the Caesar Augustus.
Under this
right?
sign conquer.
Right.
And there's different interpretations, literal translations
right.
of what he saw, but that's essentially it. Under this sign conquer.
And the amazing battle that happens, he comes, now remember, think of Rome as Rome, and it's a walled city, and it has a river, and you're not going to fight Rome at the wall, and yet he marches his army up to the wall, and tell the rest of the story.
Well, and he had been bringing, it was a conflict between two men who wanted to be Caesar Augustus, the ultimate ruler of Rome. And had he had to lay siege to Rome, it would have been a very, very bloody battle that would have lasted perhaps for months or even longer. And yet the other emperor, who was his opponent, felt there was no question that he was going to win this battle. And
Arrogance.
Arrogance. And he sent his forces out to destroy Constantine and his army. And he maneuvered in some tactical ways that would put him at a disadvantage, and much of his army was drowned, and the rest of it was defeated.
He comes out of the walled city, crosses the river, and says, "You're not going to destroy us." Constantine backs the army up. They fall in the river. They're slaughtered, and they drown in the river.
Yeah, including the emperor himself, fell off the bridge and was drowned in the river.
Amazing, amazing story. And it was that turning point. It was that moment that, I mean, we could argue about Constantine. I think Constantine was an interesting guy.
Yeah.
And you can argue about Constantine whether he was good or bad. But it was a turning point from Christians being hunted, depending on who the emperor was, being persecuted, to all of a sudden, wait a minute, we're somebody.
Yeah.
And it was the turning point for Europe.
Yeah, but you know, Constantine was in what would consider late middle age at the time. He was in his 40s, spent his entire life as a pagan, and I think there was a conversion process that took place over several years.
My favorite is he didn't get baptized until just on his deathbed. As emperor. This is my favorite quote, and I'm butchering it. I don't know if you know this quote because it's not in the book, but he said something along the lines of, "As emperor, there are things I have to do. Baptize me when I'm dying."
Yeah.
He wanted the forgiveness for all the crap he had to do. Save it. I've got bad stuff I got to do.
That's covering your bases.
Yeah.
But